The air in the trauma bay crackled with humiliation. In front of the entire ER staff, Dr. Brandon Mitchell, the arrogant chief of trauma, grabbed Nurse Keisha Williams by her braids and yanked her head back. Everyone froze, waiting for her to cry, to break, to crumble. They saw a quiet, invisible nurse, but they were wrong. What they couldn't see was the warrior hidden beneath the scrubs, a woman forged in the fires of covert warfare. He thought he was humiliating a subordinate. He had no idea he had just laid hands on the most dangerous person in the hospital, and he was about to learn why that was the last mistake he would ever make. We love bringing you these intense stories of justice and hidden strength. If you love them too, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. It's free, and it massively helps our channel reach new listeners just like you. Now let's get into the story. Keisha Williams moved through the emergency department of Central Bay Medical Center like a whisper. Her deep blue scrubs, worn soft from 100 washes, seemed to blend into the washed-out, sickly green walls. Her braids, thick and neatly pulled back into a functional bun at the base of her neck, were styled with a severity that discouraged conversation. She was a ghost in plain sight, efficient, meticulous, and utterly, completely overlooked. The air in the ER was a familiar, acrid soup, the sharp, sterile sting of antiseptic that burned the nostrils, the metallic tang of old blood in the catch basins, the burnt coffee sludge from the perpetually stained pot in the break room, and underneath it all, the subtle, sour smell of human fear that clung to the gurneys. The soundtrack was a constant cacophonous symphony, the rhythmic, multi-tonal beeping of monitors, the incessant squeak of rubber soles on polished linoleum, the pressurized hiss of oxygen ports, and soaring over it all, the booming, self-important voice of Dr. Brandon Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell, the chief of trauma, was a god in his own mind, and by extension in the minds of most of the staff. He was tall with artfully silvering temples and scrubs so impeccably tailored they looked more like a uniform than hospital issue. He moved with a predatory, unhurried confidence of a man who had never been truly told no, his arrogance a palpable force field that warped the hospital's hierarchy around him. He barely knew Keisha's name, preferring the fawning, flustered attention of the new residents or the younger nurses who vied for his rare, condescending praise. Keisha, however, did not fawn. She observed. It was what she had been trained to do: observe, analyze, act. This quiet hospital life was the antidote, the penance, for a life that had been anything but quiet. She had chosen this anonymity deliberately, a place where the loudest sound was a code alert, not an explosion. She observed him now as he held court at the Central Nurses Station, his voice's scalpel dissecting a resident's flawed diagnosis, and she observed her direct superior nurse manager Linda Chen, a woman who seemed to be perpetually hunched, as if physically apologizing for the space she occupied. Linda clutched her tablet to her chest like a shield, nodding at whatever Dr. Mitchell said, her eyes darting nervously, terrified of his temper, which was as legendary as his surgical skill. Keisha turned back to her own terminal, her gaze landing on the chart for the patient in bed 5, a Mr. Patterson. He was post-op, deemed stable, and on the discharge list, but something nagged at her, a dissonant note in the patient's otherwise clean data. She'd learned long ago in a place that smelled of dust, copper, and cordite, instead of antiseptic, to trust that nagging feeling. It was an instinct honed by screams and silence, and it had kept people alive. She scanned the labs again. Potassium was a little low, 3.1, which had noted and dismissed with an order for a single oral supplement, but it was the other number, the one everyone else skipped. The magnesium was 1.6, just inside the low end of normal, technically acceptable. But then she clicked on the EKG strip from 15 minutes ago. She traced the rhythm, her eyes narrowing. The QTC interval was 5-10 milliseconds. A cold, familiar spider of unease traced its way down her spine. Low potassium, low normal magnesium, a prolonged QT. She could see the arrhythmia in her mind's eye, the deadly twisting ribbon of torsa de diant. It was a lethal cascade, and this EKG was the sound of the first domino tipping over. She'd seen it once before in a dehydrated blast shock soldier in Mosul, a young man who looked just as stable as Mr. Patterson right before he'd coded so violently it took 3 medics to hold him down. She moved with quiet purpose, slipping through the curtain of bed 5. The air around him was still. Mr. Patterson was pale, his skin clammy to the touch, a fine sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool air. "How are you feeling, sir?" she asked, her voice low and calm, designed not to alarm. "A little swimming," he murmured, his eyes struggling to focus on her. "Feel like my heart's, doing a flip-flop." That was all she needed. She exited the curtain and approached the cluster around Dr. Mitchell. Linda Chen saw her coming and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Don't. Not now. He's in a mood." Keisha stopped a respectful 3 FT from the doctor. "Dr. Mitchell," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was not timid. It cut cleanly through the murmur of the residents. He didn't look up from his tablet mid-sentence with a resident. "And so you always check the lactate." He sighed, a theatrical put-upon sound that broadcast his annoyance. He turned his head slowly, as if it were a great effort. "What is it, Nurse Williams?" He always paused as if her name was a difficult clinical term he was forced to recall. "It's about Mr. Patterson in bed 5, Keisha said, holding her ground, her hands clasped calmly behind her back. "His QTC is 5 on 10 and he's symptomatic. His magnesium is 1.6. I'm concerned about torsads. I think we should hold the discharge, start 2G of mag sulfate, and move him to a telemetry bed." Dr. Mitchell actually blinked. Then he smiled, a thin, cruel expression that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "You're concerned. Are you now? You think you found a zebra, nurse?" He tapped his own tablet with an aggressive finger. "I've seen the labs. His mag is by definition normal. The QT is a common benign effect of the diuretic he's on. He's fine. He's taking up a bed we need." He looked around at the residents. "See, this is what we call overthinking. It wastes resources." He turned back to Keisha, his smile gone. "Discharge him." He turned back to the resident, the dismissal as absolute as a door slamming shut in her face. Keisha felt the familiar cold burn in her stomach. It was the same burn she'd felt when that arrogant field surgeon had ignored her warning about a blast victim's internal bleeding. "She's just a medic," the surgeon had said, his voice dripping with the same condescension. That soldier had died on the operating table, his belly full of blood. "Doctor," Keisha said again. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but insistent. The one word hung in the air. He spun on her. His height was imposing, and he used it, stepping into her personal space, a clear act of physical intimidation. The smell of his expensive cedarwood cologne was suffocating, a chemical clean scent trying to mask the sickness of the room. "Are you deaf or just insubordinate?" I said. "Discharge the patient." "Now, are we clear?" Behind him, Linda Chen winced, her face pale, and took a half step back. The residents stared at their shoes, their silence, a form of complicity. Keisha held his gaze for one long, silent second. The air crackled. Her mind was a fortress. She had been stared down by men holding rifles, not just clipboards. But this was not that world. In this world, her hands were tied by law and hierarchy. She couldn't act. She could only warn. And she had, "Yes, doctor," she said, her voice a perfect monotone. "Clear." She turned and walked away, her back straight, feeling the burn of his stare on her shoulder blades. She returned to the terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard, typing a detailed note. 9:30, Dr. Mitchell, notified of QTC 510, symptomatic patient CO palpitations, lightheadedness, and borderline MG 1.6. 6 voiced concern for potential torsads DeWant. Dr. Mitchell verbally declined further workup, stated patient is stable, and ordered immediate discharge. She hit enter and the note was locked into the chart. It wasn't justice. It wasn't patient safety. But it was the only armor she had. It was a round in the chamber, a tripwire set. As she walked away to prepare the man's discharge papers, a wave of cold futility washed over her. She couldn't shake the image of that soldier, or the cold, hard fact that arrogance was a pathogen as deadly as any virus. The rest of the evening shift descended into the usual simmering chaos, but the tension from the morning's confrontation lingered, a static charge in the air. Then at 8:17 p.m., the world tore open. The sound of the code red alert was not a beep, it was a shriek, a brutal electronic wail that sliced through the ER's normal den, a sound designed to jolt the adrenal glands. It was followed by the overhead announcement. The dispatcher's voice strained with panic, the words clipping, code red, mass casualty, Highway 101, multi-vehicle pileup involving a school bus, all available staff report to the ER immediately. Repeat, code red. For a full second, the ER froze. Every doctor, every nurse, every tech locked in a collective gasp. A resident dropped a chart, its clatter unnaturally loud in the sudden hush. Then the world exploded. Doors burst open, carts rattled, people shouted. The relative calm of the evening was vacuumed out, replaced by a roaring, high-octane panic. But as the chaos erupted, something inside Keisha Williams settled. The noise, the fear, the shouting, it all faded to a distant rushing hum. Her pulse, which had been thrumming with residual anger at Mitchell, slowed to a steady, powerful rhythm. The frantic, jerky energy of the ER staff became a series of slow-motion movements to her hyper-aware senses. The antiseptic smell was gone. In her mind, she smelled dust. She smelled hot metal and diesel. She heard the thump, thump, thump of a rotor blade. This she understood. This was not a world of egos and bureaucratic dismissal. This was a world of physics and physiology, of blood and air, of life and death, measured in seconds. This was her world. "Linda!" she called out, and her voice, though not loud, cut through the rising panic with an authority that surprised them both. "Get the trauma bay stocked. All of them tell Central to send every crash card and all the Ong blood they have." Now, Linda, who had been spinning in a circle, her eyes wide with terror, her hands flapping uselessly, stopped. She looked at Keisha, and for a second, the quiet nurse's sheer, unshakable calm seemed to anchor her. She nodded, her fear replaced by a flicker of purpose, and ran for the phone. The automatic doors to the ambulance bay hissed open, and the night flooded in, bringing with it the wail of approaching sirens. Not one, but a dozen overlapping and growing closer. The flash of red and blue lights painted the walls in grotesque, dancing strokes of color, and the cold, wet smell of rain and diesel fuel washed over them. "First wave coming in!" a paramedic shouted. His voice and the flood began. They came in a torrent. The walking wounded strew with blood and glass, their faces dazed masks of shock. The critical on backboards, their bodies twisted into unnatural shapes. Paramedic Carlos Rodriguez, a man whose weathered face had seen it all, was the first to burst through with a critical patient, his boots skidding on the linoleum. "Got a bad one, Keisha!" he yelled, his face grim as he skillfully wheeled the gurney toward Trauma 1, already heading for her, not for the doctor. "Female, approx 17, unrestrained passenger, ejected GCS6, flail chest, obvious head lack, SATs are dropping. We tubed her in the field, but I'm not sure it's holding. She's fighting it." Keisha was already moving alongside him, her eyes scanning the patient. A young woman, her face swollen and bruised, a bloody mat of blonde hair plastered to her skull. Keisha's gloved hands moved with practiced, impersonal speed, her fingers brushing the cold, clammy skin. "Get around the monitor," she ordered a floating resident. She grabbed an ambu bag from the wall, disconnected the field ventilator, and began bagging the patient manually, feeling the resistance. It was wrong. Spongy and tight. There's no pressure. The tube's displaced or she has a tension pneumo. You're right. She looked at Carlos. Good call. She's tachycardic and hypotensive. Heart rate 140, BP 80 over 40, the resident called out, his voice high and ready on the edge of panic. 2 large bore IVs wide open, Keisha commanded, her voice a clean, sharp contrast to his. Get a trauma panel, type and cross, and hang 2 units of ON egg. Now! Dr. Brandon Mitchell burst into the room, his face a mask of adrenaline. He was in his element, the king of the catastrophe, ready to direct the battle. Who's this? What do we have? 17-year-old female ejected. GCS 6, Keisha reported. Her voice clipped professional as she continued to bag the patient, her eyes on the monitor. Field intubation failed, bagging her now. Diminished breath sounds on the right. She needs a chest tube and a new airway stat. I'll take the airway. You! Mitchell pointed at the resident. Get the chest tube kit. I want her head locked down for C-spine. He grabbed a laryngoscope and a new ET, physically pushing Keisha aside. I've got this. And just as he leaned in to intubate, the world went dark. It wasn't a flicker. It was a thud. A deep terminal thump from the bowels of the hospital as if a giant beast had died. The main power grid, overloaded by the sudden demand of every machine and light, failed. The overhead fluorescent lights died instantly, plunging the ER into a terrifying murky darkness, lit only by the hellish red glow of the exit signs and the faint, chaotic beams of phone flashlights. The primary ventilators, the monitors, the digital displays, all silent. A collective scream rose from the wider ER. For one beat, there was only blackness and the sound of panicked breathing. Then the emergency backup generators kicked in, but they kicked in wrong. A bank of circuits had fried. A smell of ozone and burning plastic filled the air. The main lights in the trauma bay stayed dead. The primary monitor above the patient remained black. Only the dim red emergency, lights on the floor casting long, monstrous shadows, and the tiny battery-powered wail of the portable pulse, oximeter provided any light or sound. Damn it. Mitchell roared into the darkness. I can't see. Someone get me a light. Keisha hadn't flinched. She hadn't gasped. The moment the lights died, her hand had instinctively gone to the ambu bag, her rhythm unbroken. She'd worked in worse. She'd done procedures by the red light of a single headlamp in a collapsing bunker, the world shaking around her. This was just quiet light. Mitchell bellowed again, his voice raw with panic. The resident fumbled with his phone, its small, weak beam dancing over the patient, the walls, Mitchell's face. I can't, the angle. Get out of my way, Keisha said. It wasn't a request. She pushed past the resident, her hand finding the crash cart in the dark by muscle memory. She grabbed a portable laryngoscope, one with its own battery-powered light, and slapped it into Mitchell's hand. Here. He snatched it, his arrogance dissolving. The pressure was mounting, and his godlike composure was cracking, revealing the terrified, fallible man beneath. The mass casualty event was overwhelming. The power failure was a personal, targeted insult. He was losing control. He leaned over the young woman, his movements jerky and fast. The beam from the scope was bright, but his hands were shaking. Come on, I can't see the cords. There's too much blood. Sats are 88. Keisha stated, her eyes locked on the tiny glowing number of the portable pulse socks. 85. Suction, Mitchell yelled, jamming the suction tube blindly into the patient's mouth. It's not working. Damn it. The suction is dead, too. 80, Keisha said. The patient's body was beginning to twitch. A hypoxic seizure. 78. Doctor, you're too deep. There's a hematoma shifting her larynx. You won't find the trachea that way. I don't need a nurse telling me what I'm seeing. He snarled, pulling the tube out and trying to reinsert it, his movements growing more desperate, more violent with his frustration. 74. Doctor, "You are failing the airway," Keisha stated, her voice like ice. "She's crashing. I just need one." His hands were visibly shaking now, slick with sweat and blood. He was no longer a surgeon. He was just a panicked man killing a patient in the dark red shadows. Keisha knew this moment. It was the pivot point, the second where protocol failed and action was the only thing left. She reached forward, her hand moving to apply external lingual manipulation to physically push the larynx into his line of sight. "Doctor, let me adjust the cricoid pressure." That's when he snapped. All his frustration, his fear, his shattered ego, it consolidated into a single blinding point of rage. He didn't just turn, he exploded. "Who are you to tell me how to do my job, nurse?" he screamed, his voice cracking with a hysterical edge. He lunged, his hand shooting out, not to push her, but to grab, his fingers tangled in her braids, clenched into a fist, and he yanked her head back by her hair with a cruel, humiliating force. The ER, already paused by the darkness, fell into a vacuum of pure shock. Linda Chen, who had just run in with a fistful of triage tags, let out a tiny strangled scream. Carlos Rodriguez, standing by the door, froze, his jaw dropping. The resident stared, paralyzed, his phone light illuminating the horrific tableau. The godlike doctor, his face a mask of fury, physically assaulting a nurse. Pain, sharp and burning, exploded at Keisha's scalp. Her head was snapped back, her neck exposed. She was looking at the red-lit ceiling at the face of the arrogant, terrified man towering over her. She smelled his sweat, his fear, and the lingering offensive tang of his cedarwood cologne. And in that instant, everything stopped. The ER, the hospital, the civilian world. It all dissolved. There was no sound. There was no Dr. Mitchell. There was no humiliation. There was only a threat, a hold, and a mission. The mission was the patient on the table whose SATs were now plummeting past 70. The threat was the man attached to her hair, her training buried for years under layers of quiet compliance and sterile blue scrubs, took over. It was not a thought. It was a reflex forged in pain and repetition in a place she never spoke of. The world didn't speed up. It slowed down. She saw every particle of dust in the resident's flashlight beam. She felt the cool air on her exposed throat. Her body moved. It was not fast. It was fluid. It was an economy of motion that was terrifying in its precision. 1. Her left hand shot up, not to claw at his hand, but to strike it. Her fingers, rigid as steel, jabbed precisely into the cluster of nerves at his radial artery, a point she knew would cause an involuntary release. A jolt like electricity shot up his arm. His grip, which had been vice-like, spasmed and loosened, his fingers flying open with a yelp of pained surprise. 2. As his hold broke, she didn't pull back. She advanced, rooting her left foot on the linoleum. She pivoted on her right heel, dropping her center of gravity and using his own forward aggressive momentum against him. 3. Her left hand, having broken his grip, slid up his arm to secure his elbow, locking the joint. Her right hand clamped down on his wrist, twisting it inward. It was a perfect, inescapable slock. 4. She applied pressure, up on the elbow, down on the wrist. His body had no choice but to follow. A choked grunt of pained surprise ripped from his throat. His feet in their expensive customs, soled sneakers left the sterile linoleum floor. He was airborne for a terrifying half-second before Keisha completed the takedown. He hit the floor with a sickening thud that echoed in the stunned silence. The air was forced from his lungs in a pained, wet whoosh. Before he could even register the ceiling, Keisha was on top of him. She didn't follow him down. She drove him down, one knee planted firmly on his ribs, her entire body weight leveraged over the hyperextended joint lock on his arm. He was pinned, helpless, neutralized. The air in the trauma bay was so still, so thick with shock that the only sound was the failing, rapid beep, beep, beep of the pulox. 68%. Keisha looked down at the man beneath her. His face, illuminated in the patchy light, was a mask of utter disbelief, excruciating pain, and dawning terror. She released him. She didn't help him up. She simply let go and rose to her feet in one smooth, coiled motion, as if she were getting up from a simple stretch. Her posture radiated a power no one in that room had ever seen. Her braids were slightly askew, the only sign of the assault. Her voice, when it came, was not her nurse voice. It was a voice they had never heard. It was cold, clear, and absolute. It was the voice of command. "You will never lay a hand on me or any other staff member again, doctor," she said, her words cutting through the darkness. "And now you need to step aside. Your patient is deteriorating." She didn't wait for a reply. She turned her back on him, a final complete dismissal. She faced the patient, her eyes scanning the monitor. SATS 65. Hypoxic seizures racked the small body. He's right. The airway is awash, she said to herself. Then to the room. This is a surgical airway now. The resident was still staring at Dr. Mitchell, who was gasping for air on the floor, clutching his wrist. "A crick. We can't. We have to call surgery. There's no time," Keisha snapped. "Give me a 10-blade scalpel, a 6.0 ET, and the barrel of a 10cc syringe. Move." The resident, galvanized by her sheer terrifying authority, jumped as if struck. He fumbled in the crash cart, his hands shaking, and produced the items, slapping them into her waiting palm. Keisha's gloved fingers, steady as rock, found the landmarks on the young woman's throat. Her touch precise despite the blood and swelling. Thyroid notch slide down crickid membrane. It was muscle memory. She had done this in the back of a Blackhawk in total darkness, with the smell of burning jet fuel in her nostrils and the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the rotor blades vibrating through the floor, a dying soldier beneath her. Her hand didn't shake. 1. A swift vertical incision through the skin. The red light made the blood look black, thick as oil. 2. A precise horizontal cut through the cricoid membrane. 3. A small dark opening, a faint wet hiss of air. She inserted the syringe barrel to hold the tract open, then fed the 6.0 tube through it. Umbu bag. The resident slapped it into her hand. She connected it and gave a squeeze. The room held its breath. The patient's chest rose. Keisha gave another breath. The chest rose again. She looked at the pulse oximeter. The number had stopped falling. It held at 64, then 68, 75, 82, 90, 96. A collective sigh. A gasp of released tension filled the room. Keisha secured the new airway with practiced efficiency. She stood, her hands bloody, her expression unreadable. She looked at the stunned team. The resident, Linda Chen, Carlos Rodriguez, all staring at her as if she had just grown a second head. Dr. Mitchell was slowly, painfully pulling himself up against the wall, his face pale, his arm clutched to his chest. Keisha's command voice was still active. "She's stable, but she's not out of it. I want a full trauma panel. Get radiology in here for a stat chest and C-spine, and someone needs to get that chest tube in now." She looked directly at the resident. You can do it. I'll walk you through. Get the kit." The resident, who had been terrified of Dr. Mitchell 5 minutes ago, now looked at Keisha with something approaching religious awe. He nodded, his fear gone, replaced by pure focus. "Yes, nurse." The chaos in the ER began to subside, not because the crisis was over, but because it now had a center. Keisha Williams, the quiet nurse, had become the unwavering center of gravity, and the entire department, starved for leadership, began to orbit her. She moved from patient to patient, her intervention swift, her commands clear, her presence a tangible force that settled the panic. The team, which had been floundering under Mitchell's erratic, adrenaline-fueled control, now worked with a new, quiet efficiency, following her lead without question. Dr. Mitchell remained by the wall of Trauma 1, watching. He hadn't moved. A nurse, seeing him clutching his arm, approached. "Doctor, are you okay? Let me look at that wrist." He just waved her off, his eyes locked on Keisha as she directed the resident in the chest tube insertion, her voice calm and pedagogical. Then his gaze drifted to the patient on the table, the young woman whose life Keisha had just saved, the young woman he had almost killed. Just then, a different nurse, who had been tasked with cutting away the patient's rain-oaked clothing to search for identification, let out a small, horrified gasp. She was holding a small leather wallet soaked through. She looked inside and her face went ashen. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror, not at Keisha, but at Dr. Mitchell. "Doctor," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, Dr. Mitchell." The wallet, the ID. Mitchell, still dazed, his arms screaming in pain, looked at her. "What? What about it? It's her." The nurse stammered, holding up a driver's license. "It's Madison. Doctor, it's your daughter." The words hung in the air, heavier and more devastating than the power failure, than the take-on. Dr. Mitchell stumbled forward, his face a mask of disbelief. "No, it's not. It can't be." He lurched to the gurney, pushing past the resident, and looked, really looked, at the patient's face, now partially cleaned by Keisha. He saw the familiar curve of her jaw, the small mole by her left ear beneath the blood, and swelling. "Madison," he breathed. The word was not a name. It was a prayer, a curse, a raw animal sound of absolute despair. He collapsed onto a nearby stool, his head falling into his hands. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The patient he had been failing, the patient he had nearly killed, the patient she had saved, was his own child. He looked up at Keisha, who had paused her work, her face unreadable. His eyes were wide, filled with a terrifying, profound cocktail of gratitude, shame, and undiluted horror. You saved." He couldn't finish the sentence. He just sobbed, a broken, wretched sound that echoed in the now quiet trauma bay. The main ER door slid open again. This time, it wasn't a patient. It was Chief Daniel Foster, the head of hospital security. Foster was a tall, imposing man who had been an MP in the Army for 20 years, and he carried himself with the stillness that was more intimidating than any bluster. He hadn't been paged for the code red. He'd been alerted by the code violet panic button Linda had slammed the instant Mitchell laid hands on Keisha. He had spent the last 3 minutes in his office watching the security footage from Trauma 1, watching the assault, watching the takedown, watching the crasiotomy. He walked past the other beds, his eyes scanning the room, landing immediately on Keisha Williams. He walked past the broken Dr. Mitchell, past the wide-eyed Linda, and stopped directly in front of Keisha. His voice was low, growly, and held no surprise whatsoever. "Nurse Williams," he said, a simple statement of fact. "I'm Chief Foster." He gestured with his chin toward Dr. Mitchell, who was still slumped on the stool. That slock and take down that wasn't nursing school. He paused, his eyes analytical, assessing. He'd seen that economy of motion before, and that field cricotomy done in the dark with a syringe barrel. "Are you the Keisha Williams from the Phoenix Initiative?" The name dropped into the room like a grenade. Mitchell looked up, his face confused, Linda's brow furrowed. But Keisha's calm, in-control expression finally fractured just for a second. Her eyes closed. The Phoenix Initiative. A name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years. A name that meant black ops, covert medical extraction, a team of elite medics trained to be as deadly as they were a life-saving. A past she had buried under scrubs and discharge papers. She opened her eyes and met Foster's gaze. She didn't speak. She just gave one slow, deliberate nod. Foster nodded back, a silent, profound understanding passing between them. He turned, his gaze sweeping over Dr. Mitchell and the rest of the silent, listening staff. For those of you who don't know, Foster announced his voice carrying the weight of authority. Nurse Williams served in a highly specialized, covert military medical unit. The Phoenix Initiative means her medical training is classified. Her expertise is far beyond what any of us, myself included, could comprehend. A ripple of whispers, then a deep, respectful silence spread through the ER. Every dismissive glance, every ignored suggestion, every time she'd been treated as just a nurse, it all recontextualized itself in their minds. Dr. Mitchell, his face pale and strewn with tears, slowly, painfully got to his feet. He walked toward Keisha, his limp, useless arm held against his chest. He stood before her, the arrogant god now a humbled, broken man. "Keisha," he whispered, his voice thick and raw. I owe you everything, my daughter and I am so profoundly sorry." Keisha looked at him. The command voice was gone. The coldness was gone. Her nurse voice returned, but it was now laced with an undeniable weight, an authority that no one would ever question again. "Doctor," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "your daughter needs you to be her father right now. We'll take care of her." Weeks passed. Madison Mitchell made a full recovery. The scar on her throat, a tiny, neat reminder of the night she almost died. The incident was officially buried as a, quote, critical equipment failure during a mass casualty event, but the truth resonated through the halls of Central Bay Medical Center. Keisha Williams still wore the same deep blue scrubs. She still tied her braids back in the same neat, functional bun, but she was no longer invisible. A new code red hit a 5-alarm fire downtown. The ER was slammed. Dr. Mitchell was directing traffic, his arm in a sling from the, quote, complications of a fall, his movements more considered, less bombastic. He found himself struggling with a complex burn patient, the protocols blurring in his mind. He stopped. He scanned the chaotic room, his eyes searching. He found her calmly intubating a different patient. "Nurse Williams," he called out. Keisha finished her task and walked over, her expression neutral. "Keisha," he said, humility now a natural part of his vocabulary. "I'm not sure on the fluid resuscitation for this body surface area. Your thoughts?" Keisha Williams looked at the patient, at the monitors, and at the doctor. She stepped forward, and this time, as she began to speak, her voice clear and confident, the entire room, from the greenest resident to the chief of trauma himself, fell silent and listened. If this story moved you, subscribe now for more tales of extraordinary professionals who go beyond the call of duty. Another story you may enjoy is on screen now. Your next inspiration is just one click away.